So what are we talking about when we talk about resistance? This is actually a bit of a confusing topic because the idea of resistance proliferates in a lot of our political language. You'll have people in government saying that they are resisting something, or people in a House of Congress or a legislature. People engaging in protests, like perfectly respectable protests, they'll say they're resisting. But this isn't really what we're talking about. We need to make a distinction between resistance on one hand and ordinary political action on the other. Ordinary political action tends to be much more acceptable. Sometimes people call it resistance, but it's not. When we talk about resistance, we're talking about generally two types of things. The first is justice-seeking resistance. These are actions that are designed to reform unjust political institutions, right? They tend to be public, but not necessarily so. And there's often a degree of privilege involved. So think about, for example, the American Revolution, right? The people who resisted the British Empire were in a position to publicly resist, right? They could get their arms, they could rally against the British government, they could form an army to resist. They were privileged landowners generally. They could be publicly resisting. Now, the other side of this is injustice evading resistance. This means to evade or diminish the effects of injustice. It's usually clandestine, it's hidden, and associated with subalterns, people who don't have a lot of political power. Now, I really find this type of resistance interesting because it hits what gets called by James Scott the infrapolitical. What do I mean by infrapolitical? Well, think about infrared, right? Infrared color is a color that we can't see with our eyes. It's outside of our ordinary spectrum of perception. Infrapolitical resistance are forms of resistance that don't normally make our radar of politics. One of the ones that I often think about is fugitive slaves. Fugitive slaves in the 19th century of America weren't really thought of as engaging in resistance, right? It wasn't an overt political action to try to escape to the free states in the north or into British North America, Canada, as it's now known. But this was actually quite a political act. It was a rejection of being a slave. And when enough slaves started to engage in this form of resistance, they started to cause slavery to become unstable, right? One of the sort of stories that we tell ourselves about American history is that Lincoln freed the slaves. But the fact of the matter is, by the time he had the Emancipation Proclamation, too many slaves had freed themselves. There was no going back. So we generally under-examine and underestimate how this works around in resistance. The other one I'll mention, because this one is fun, the Rebecca riots, which happened in my ancestral homeland of Wales, where working-class men dressed up as women and assaulted tax collectors. Why dress up as women? They dragged up because they couldn't be identified, right? They are sub-public. They are anonymous acts. Also anonymous letter writing. There's tons of this. And this all sort of hits in something that Tommy Shelby's identified. He calls it impure resistance. When we talk about resistance, we often think that people have to be moral paragons, right? Really principled people who comport themselves above what we would expect from most ordinary people. Think about your Martin Luther Kings. Think about Gandhi. Think about Rosa Parks. She started the protests against segregated buses, and then compare them. Shelby compares them to NWA. NWA has a very famous old-time rap song called Fuck the Police, right? A lot of people found this to be a really off-putting title because it's like, oh, why would you say such things about the police? Well, if you grow up in South Central LA, the cops aren't your friends, right? There's a lot of anger against police in Black communities in the States, and a lot of communities really don't like the police. Now, impurity might be a different sort of thing. It might be aesthetic, it causes outrage, saying the word fuck, but it also might be adopting methods that people don't like breaking property, something like this. Albert Hirschman provides us with a good way of thinking about this, right? When he talks about the difference between voice and exit. The former is articulating injustice, and the latter is simply getting out, right? When we're seeking reform, we often speak against injustice, but when we just want to get away from it, when that's all we have, then sometimes we just try to leave. But sometimes voice and exit, can't really be sought, or you only have voice. And a lot of oppressed agents will draw on things like rap music as a symbolic expression of disgust at the status quo, at rage. They know they can't change it, but they want people to know that they are angry. And this gets us to kind of what resistance is. It's something that occurs outside of that ordinary spectrum of politics. It's something that is either going to break a law or shatter the norms that we have in our political lives. We can think about this in a practical sense. Sometimes dissidents do things that we don't approve of. Just Stop Oil, for example, got a lot of anger. We can think about the protests that are happening right now against the war in Israel and Palestine. People have started occupying spaces on university campuses to demand divestment. A lot of people are very angry about this. They feel perhaps threatened, or they feel like this is just going too far. There should be a more polite way. But this is part of the story of resistance, that sometimes norms have to be pushed, sometimes they have to be broken. But there do have to be some guardrails on this. What do we owe when we are resisting? And that's when we're going to look at our first test case, disobedience and democracy, and the question of fidelity to the law.